A racing machine traveling at over 200 miles per hour flips through the air before detonating into a colossal, inescapable fireball. It is a scene of paralyzing horror. But the agonizing detail of this 1957 tragedy, the driver trailing just seconds behind, forced to helplessly watch the inferno consume the wreckage, is the victim's own son. Motorsport history has rarely recorded a family nightmare of this magnitude. Why were a father and son battling on the same lethal asphalt? And what catastrophic failure transformed a veteran racer into a human torch? July 14, 1957. The midsummer sun hangs like a suffocating anvil over the picturesque Champagne region of northern France. The sky is a vast, uninterrupted canopy of piercing blue, devoid of a single cloud to offer even the briefest moment of shade. Beneath this blistering heat, the dark, abrasive asphalt of the legendary Reims circuit is baking. The intense thermal energy radiating off the tarmac distorts the horizon, transforming the notoriously flat country roads into a watery mirage that plays cruel tricks on the human eye. The air hovering just above the track surface is thick and oppressive. It is choked with the toxic stench of high-octane racing fuel, the lingering aroma of burning castor oil, and the acrid scent of raw rubber melting against the scorching ground. This geographical location is not a purpose-built, sterile, modern racing facility. The Reims circuit is a terrifying, rudimentary triangle composed almost entirely of public rural highways closed off for the weekend. It is a venue infamous within the motorsport community for one defining characteristic: its devastatingly long, arrow-straight stretches. These uninterrupted straights are the exact locations where the primitive, lightweight racing machines of the 1950s reach their terminal velocities. Drivers competing in the coupe de vitesse are forced by the track's layout to hold the throttle wide open, pinning the heavy metal pedal to the floorboard for agonizingly continuous periods. The engines scream at their maximum redline for miles on end, putting a catastrophic level of thermal and mechanical stress on the internal combustion components and the fragile bias-ply tires. The borders of this high-speed arena offer zero forgiveness. There are no energy-absorbing barriers, no wide gravel runoff areas, and no protective tire walls. The edges of the racing surface are defined by rigid stone farm walls, deep agricultural ditches, and solid rows of ancient trees that stand alongside the road like silent executioners. They wait patiently for a single human error, a sudden gust of crosswind, or a mechanical failure to send a fragile machine hurtling into their wooden trunks. To step onto the Reims circuit during this era is to step into a high-speed theater of catastrophe, fully accepting that the margin between glorious victory and sudden, brutal death is non-existent. Down on the starting grid, the atmosphere is a scene of organized, deafening violence. The massive wooden grandstands, packed with thousands of cheering French spectators, dissolve into a chaotic blur of color against the overwhelming volume of raw combustion. The noise is not merely loud, it is a concussive force that strikes the chest cavities of everyone standing nearby. Dozens of tuned racing engines idle simultaneously, barking, spitting fuel, and shooting bright orange flames from their unprotected exhaust pipes. The acoustic assault vibrates so intensely through the ground that it shakes the dust from the concrete pit walls. Frantic team mechanics, their hands stained black with engine grease, scramble around the tubular chassis of the vehicles. They make desperate, last-minute adjustments, turning steel wrenches in the smoke-filled air. The drivers sitting inside these volatile machines are wholly vulnerable. They are strapped into cramped open cockpits, surrounded on all sides by thin aluminum fuel tanks sloshing with gallons of explosive liquid. They wear simple cotton polo shirts, canvas trousers, and soft leather aviator caps that offer zero defense against the physics of a high-speed impact or a sudden chemical fire. They sit exposed to the elements, their faces coated in a layer of dark soot and track dust. Yet, amidst this dangerous theater of speed, an unsettling human drama is quietly playing out on the burning asphalt. Look closely at the men gripping the wooden steering wheels, their knuckles turning white under the leather driving gloves. Amidst the grid populated by young, reckless daredevils, eager to risk everything for a silver trophy and a fleeting moment of glory, there sits a man whose face tells a vastly different experience story. His features are lined with the trenches of hard-fought life experience. His eyes, visible behind the thick glass of his racing goggles, reflect a calm, calculated focus. This man is Bill Whitehouse. He is 48 years old. In the perilous, short-lived profession of Grand Prix racing during the late 1950s, merely surviving to reach the age of 48 makes a man an undeniable elder statesman of the paddock. He is a rare survivor in an uncompromising game that mercilessly claims the lives of men half his age on a weekly basis. Bill is a seasoned veteran, a man who has witnessed the horrific, blood-stained evolution of global motorsport firsthand. He has personally seen close friends perish on the asphalt, attended the somber funerals of his peers, and intimately understands the lethal stakes of the metal beast idling beneath him. He does not possess the blind invincibility of youth. He possesses a rational understanding of exactly how close the shadow of death hovers over every corner and long straightaway. But today, on the scorching French tarmac of Reims, the psychological burden resting on Bill Whitehouse's shoulders is infinitely more complex and agonizingly heavy than his own personal survival. Trace his line of sight across the crowded, vibrating starting grid. He is not staring down a bitter rival, nor is he calculating the lines of a foreign competitor. He is looking directly at his own flesh and blood. Sitting securely in another volatile racing machine, positioned just a few yards away on the very same lethal stretch of asphalt, preparing to challenge the terrifying French Straits, is Brian Whitehouse. His son. The emotional weight and the staggering statistical improbability of this moment are unfathomable. A father and a son, simultaneously competing against one another in the same high-speed, lethal event. They are sharing the dangerous track, breathing the same toxic air, and facing the exact same grim reaper waiting patiently in the sweepers. For Bill, the adrenaline-fueled focus required to survive a race at Reims is now permanently intertwined with the primal anxiety of a parent. He knows intimately, perhaps better than anyone else sitting on that grid, just how incredibly fragile and unpredictable these mechanical beasts truly are. He knows in horrifying detail what happens when a stressed tire shreds at maximum velocity. He knows the sickening sound of a steering column snapping under pressure. He knows the horror of a ruptured fuel tank. And he knows, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that his own son is tightly strapped into a machine capable of delivering that fiery fate. Yet, competitive racing is the undeniable lifeblood of the Whitehouse family. It is a shared, consuming passion that transcends the logical human fear of death. Through the thick haze of blue exhaust smoke and the roar of the idling engines, they exchange a final, silent glance across the vibrating metal. It is a fleeting moment of familial connection, swallowed by the noise of the competition. There is immense pride welling up in Bill's eyes, watching his young boy master the same dangerous craft. But that pride is shadowed by the silent prayer of a father hoping the abrasive French asphalt shows them both mercy today. The track marshals begin to frantically wave the grid clear. The exhausted mechanics sprint toward the safety of the concrete pit wall, abandoning the drivers to their solitary fate. The collective noise of the grid elevates from a stuttering idle to a synchronized, terrifying scream as over 24 engines clear their throats. The tension hanging over the asphalt becomes so thick that it feels physically suffocating to breathe. Every driver on the grid reaches up and makes final nervous adjustments to their goggles. Pulling down their visors, shutting out the picturesque French countryside, and narrowing their universe down to the gray, shimmering ribbon of road stretching ominously toward the distant horizon. The official race starter steps onto the edge of the track, raising the starting flag high into the blistering summer air. The engines hit their screaming mechanical redline. The drivers expertly balance the heavy clutches against the raw horsepower, their muscles tense, waiting for the defining signal that will unleash the mechanical hounds. The intense heat radiating off the tarmac distorts the shapes of the brightly painted cars, making them look like violent mirages ready to explode into forward motion. The ticking clock of survival has officially begun its countdown. The heavy flag drops. Clutches are aggressively dumped. A deafening, apocalyptic symphony of screaming metal, spinning bias-ply tires, and burning white smoke instantly envelops the starting grid. The pack launches forward off the starting line. A chaotic swarm of silver, green, and red machines, fighting desperately for critical track position as they hurtle toward the first high-speed corner. Both Bill and Brian are swallowed within the chaotic pack, consumed by the unforgiving rhythm of the coupe de vitesse. They surge forward, carrying a shared love of speed flowing through their bloodline. But the true cruelty of that day requires a look back at the past, revealing exactly what kind of extraordinary father the 48-year-old man behind the wheel truly was. Look past the heavy leather racing goggles, the layers of ingrained grease, and the deafening roar of the combustion engines. The man sitting inside that vibrating metal cockpit was not some arrogant aristocrat treating the lethal sport of Grand Prix racing as a glamorous weekend hobby. He was William James Whitehouse. But to the fiercely competitive, cynical men who populated the dangerous European racing paddocks of the 1950s, he was universally known by a singular moniker, Big Bill. The motorsport grid during this romanticized but deadly era was largely dominated by European nobility, wealthy heirs, and fearless international playboys flush with generational wealth. They drove expensive machines, drank expensive champagne, and treated danger as a casual playground. Big Bill was the undeniable antithesis of this glamorous high society stereotype. He was a deeply grounded, proudly working-class British mechanic to his core. He did not come from ancient castles, sprawling country estates, or elite boarding schools. He came directly from the cold concrete floors of the Westmount garage. He was an exceptionally hard-working businessman who spent his adult life with his hands submerged in dark engine oil, fixing shattered gearboxes, diagnosing stubborn carburetors, and managing his modest local dealership in the United Kingdom. He possessed that unpretentious British charm. A man who preferred a strong cup of tea and an honest day's physical labor over lavish, champagne-soaked Paddock parties. The sharp smell of raw motor fluid, burning clutch plates, and worn rubber was ingrained in the calloused lines of his large hands. He was a genuine man of the people navigating a sport reserved almost entirely for the global elite. What makes Big Bill's presence on a starting grid so fascinating is the counterintuitive timeline of his racing career. In a terrifying era where incredibly fit drivers were frequently killed before their 30th birthdays, simply surviving past the age of 40 was considered a statistical anomaly. The physical toll of driving cars with no power steering, primitive suspension, and massive horsepower was immense. Yet, William Whitehouse did not even begin his competitive racing journey until the year 1949. He was exactly 40 years old. At an age when the few surviving veterans of the sport were quietly retiring to safe administrative roles behind concrete pit walls, Big Bill was just strapping on his racing helmet for the very first time. He was a massive, imposing figure. A true giant of a man with broad shoulders and a heavy frame, enthusiastically squeezing himself into cramped, fragile, open-wheel Formula 3 machines. It was a physically demanding endeavor, requiring immense upper body strength to wrestle the heavy steering wheels through high-speed corners. He was driven by a pure passion for speed that had blossomed late in his life. He was not an arrogant hotshot chasing lucrative factory contracts, hunting for media attention, or seeking international fame. He simply loved the raw thrill of pushing a tuned combustion engine to its screaming breaking point. His unrelenting determination, coupled with his mechanical sympathy, eventually propelled him all the way to the pinnacle of global motorsport. In 1954, against all conventional logic, the 45-year-old garage owner managed to enter a World Championship Formula One race. He boldly lined up his machine against the greatest racing figures of the era. He was living out an incredible dream on the asphalt. He was a working-class mechanic trading paint with the veritable gods of speed. Though his ambitious campaign at the highest level of the sport was cut short when a frustrating fuel system failure forced him to prematurely retire his vehicle, his mere presence on that grid commanded immense respect from his peers. He was never destined to be a multi-time world championship winner holding up silver trophies, but he was admired as a dedicated privateer who raced for the love of the machine. He proved that pure grit and mechanical knowledge could briefly elevate a man from a local garage to the world championship grid. However, his most enduring legacy within the tight-knit motorsport community had nothing to do with qualifying lap times, podium finishes, or terminal top speeds. In a brutally cold, dangerous environment where sudden death was a constant shadow over every single weekend, Big Bill provided a rare, desperately needed source of profound human warmth. The racing Paddock of the 1950s was a place of extreme psychological tension. Mechanics worked grueling, sleepless 24-hour shifts repairing shattered chassis and rebuilding blown engines. Drivers nervously chain-smoked cigarettes in the dark corners of garages to calm their frayed nerves before facing the unforgiving asphalt. It was a cynical, hardened, adrenaline-fueled world where empathy was often viewed as a fatal weakness. Into this stressful, fatalistic atmosphere walked Big Bill, completely shattering every preconceived expectation of how a competitive racing driver should behave. He was a towering, intimidating man who looked like a bare-knuckle heavyweight boxer, but he possessed the soft, generous, unconditionally loving heart of a grandfather. His defining characteristic, the beautiful detail that endeared him to everyone he ever interacted with, was his seemingly endless, quiet generosity toward the unsung, overworked heroes of the sport. While other arrogant drivers barked demanding orders at their pit crews and complained bitterly about minor suspension setup issues, Big Bill would slowly, happily wander through the busy, chaotic workshops of the Cooper racing team. His massive, grease-stained hands would be full of treats. He would casually walk up to exhausted, oil-covered mechanics who had been awake for consecutive days, men whose hands were bleeding from slipping steel wrenches against hot engine blocks, and he would quietly hand them sweet hard candies, rich chocolates, and cold ice creams. He recognized the unglamorous physical toll the sport took on the working men behind the scenes, precisely because he was fundamentally one of them. He knew exactly what it felt like to bust his knuckles on a stubborn, scalding engine component at 3 a.m. in a freezing British garage. Those small, incredibly thoughtful, simple gestures, a piece of sweet candy offered during a highly stressful qualifying session, a refreshing ice cream handed out on a sweltering summer afternoon, instantly transformed him from a mere competitor into the beloved father figure of the entire racing paddock. He was a safe sanctuary of decent human kindness in a volatile sport that routinely chewed young men up and spat them out. His genuine, warm-hearted nature naturally drew powerful, ambitious people toward him. He forged deep, lasting friendships across the entire automotive industry. One of his most notable connections was a surprisingly close bond with a young, fiercely ambitious automotive dealer who would eventually achieve global dominance in the sport, Bernie Ecclestone. Long before Ecclestone became the untouchable, billionaire supreme dictator of modern Formula One, ruling the sport with an iron fist, he was just another hungry man navigating the complex, ruthless British racing scene. And like so many others, this future titan of industry was charmed and disarmed by the massive, sweet-dispensing garage owner from Westmount. Big Bill had a way of cutting through the intense politics and massive egos of motorsport, connecting with people purely on a fundamental level of human decency. Big Bill Whitehouse was the rare, beautiful anomaly. He was a gentle, caring soul thriving inside a terrifying, violent, and unforgiving arena. He did not view his fellow competitors, or their tired mechanics, as bitter enemies to be conquered. He viewed them all as an extended, wonderful family, united by a shared addiction to speed. He brought a father's heart to every single garage he ever walked into. It was this immense love for his family and his chosen sport that ultimately drove him to lead his own son onto the track, entirely unaware that he was personally buying him a VIP ticket to witness the worst nightmare of a lifetime. The profound tragedy of this family nightmare did not actually begin when the starting flag dropped on the main event. To trace the agonizing origins of the fireball, the narrative must rewind a few crucial hours to the bright, deceptive morning sunlight of July 14th. The sprawling paddock at Reims was a hive of nervous energy as teams prepared for the early morning practice sessions. William James Whitehouse was meticulously going through his ingrained pre-race rituals. He climbed into his personal racing machine, a standard Cooper T39. This was a car he knew intimately, a vehicle whose every mechanical quirk, vibration, and harmonic resonance he understood on a personal level. He fired up the engine and took to the circuit for his preliminary shakedown laps, hunting for the perfect suspension setup. He was pushing the engine hard, reading the abrasive track surface, and dialing in his braking points. But suddenly, deep within a high-speed section of the French circuit, a sickening metallic clatter erupted from the rear of his vehicle. The main engine let go. A blinding plume of acrid white smoke instantly billowed from the exhaust pipes as the internal components of the motor tore themselves apart under the thermal stress. Hot, dark oil sprayed across the rear cowling. The catastrophic loss of power threw his body forward against the steering wheel. The rear wheels briefly locked, screaming against the asphalt, before Bill skillfully dipped the heavy clutch, severing the connection to the broken engine and coasting the mortally wounded smoking machine safely back down the pit lane. His primary engine was blown. The internal damage was terminal. His trusted car was dead. This seemingly mundane mechanical failure is the most heartbreaking crossroads in the entire history of this family's involvement in Formula One. This was the exact, fleeting instant where the universe explicitly offered Big Bill a clean, safe exit from the day's lethal festivities. He was 48 years old. He was a successful, widely respected garage owner who had nothing left to prove to the younger, more reckless generation of drivers. Fate had handed him a golden ticket to simply walk away with his life intact. The rational sequence of events dictated a very simple path forward. He should have wiped the black grease from his hands with a shop rag. He should have poured himself a strong cup of English tea, lit a cigarette, and spent the rest of the sunny French afternoon standing safely behind the protective concrete of the pit wall. He could have happily spent the day acting solely as a proud father, utilizing his decades of mechanical wisdom to cheer on his son Brian as the young boy carried the Whitehouse family legacy forward on the asphalt. The story of Bill Whitehouse should have ended right there, in the early morning practice, documented merely in the official racing ledgers as a frustrating but harmless mechanical retirement. The universe literally shattered his engine block to save his life. But standard human rationality simply does not apply to men infected by the incurable sickness of competitive motorsport. Racing drivers do not possess healthy preservation instincts. The adrenaline was already pumping heavily through his veins, chemically altering his perception of risk. The intoxicating roar of the surrounding engines acted like an irresistible siren song, forcefully pulling him back toward the danger. The mere thought of standing idle on the sidelines, dressed in his racing overalls but stripped of a steering wheel, while the rest of the grid went to war, was a psychological torment he refused to accept. The burning instinct for speed overrode his mechanical common sense and his parental duties. Instead of accepting his fate and packing up his gear, Bill began frantically wandering the bustling, oil-stained Reims paddock. He was desperately hunting for a spare machine, any available vehicle that could get him back onto the starting grid before the afternoon race commenced. His frantic, determined search eventually led him to a spare vehicle sitting quietly under the canvas awnings of another team. It was another Cooper chassis, but this specific vehicle was radically different from the one that had just broken down beneath him. It was fitted with a highly experimental, fully enclosed, streamlined aerodynamic bodywork. It was visually striking, completely smooth, and designed specifically by engineers to slice through the air on the massive, high-speed French straights. However, this specialized aerodynamic machine harbored a terrifying, classified secret. It was not merely a convenient spare car waiting for a willing driver. It was a rejected car. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the danger Bill was actively courting, one must look at the man who had previously tested this exact vehicle earlier in the weekend. That man was Jack Brabham. Brabham was a rising, fierce Australian racing legend. A man who would eventually win 3 Formula One World Championships. More importantly than his undeniable driving skill, Brabham was a highly intuitive master mechanic. He possessed a supernatural, almost psychic understanding of chassis dynamics and airflow. During earlier testing sessions at the circuit, Brabham had taken this streamlined Cooper out onto the high-speed straights to evaluate its performance. In the 1950s, automotive aerodynamics was a primitive dark art based mostly on rudimentary guesswork rather than advanced computerized wind tunnel science. Engineers mistakenly believed that simply making a car look like a smooth teardrop would naturally make it faster by reducing drag. Brabham quickly discovered the lethal flaw in this simplistic theory. He reported that at terminal velocities, the enclosed bodywork acted precisely like the wing of a commercial airplane. High-pressure air was becoming trapped underneath the flat bottom of the chassis, while the smooth, curved top created a dangerous low-pressure zone. Instead of pushing the rubber tires down into the abrasive asphalt for critical mechanical grip, the aerodynamic shell generated massive, unpredictable aerodynamic lift. It physically pulled the heavy metal car upward into the sky. Brabham described a horrifying sensation where the steering wheel would suddenly go completely light in his hands. The front tires were literally losing contact with the ground, severing his mechanical connection to the road and rendering the steering completely vague. This made the entire machine unpredictably unstable at speeds over 150 miles per hour. Jack Brabham, a brave man who regularly stared sudden death in the face without blinking, returned the car to the pits, climbed out of the cramped cockpit, and flatly refused to race it. He deemed the aerodynamic instability far too lethal, explicitly stating to the team owners that the machine was a terrifying death trap, just waiting to violently snap out of control. When a man of Jack Brabham's mechanical caliber, a man who routinely danced on the razor's edge of physical adhesion, looks at a race car and walks away in fear, that vehicle is fundamentally cursed. This was the chilling, undeniable truth of the streamlined Cooper sitting under the awning. It was a vehicle so compromised by its own experimental design that a future world champion was genuinely afraid of it. Yet, Big Bill, blinded by his desperate desire to compete alongside his son on the French asphalt, dismissed the ominous warning circulating through the Paddock whispers. He actively sought out Roy Salvadori, another respected veteran driver who had authority over the spare entry for the weekend. Bill pleaded his case. He leveraged his immense personal charm, his ingrained status as the universally beloved Big Bill, and his stubborn determination. He negotiated fiercely, refusing to take no for an answer, demanding the opportunity to take the wheel. The complex Paddock politics and the mutual respect among the veteran drivers eventually worked in his favor, sealing his doom. Salvadori, perhaps underestimating the true severity of Brabham's aerodynamic warnings, or simply worn down by the older man's relentless insistence that his decades of driving experience could handle a slightly unstable chassis, finally relented. He handed the veteran the keys to the streamlined machine. By demanding to borrow the rejected, aerodynamically cursed machine, William James Whitehouse had unknowingly signed his own brutal death warrant in invisible ink. He walked purposefully back to the awning, his face set with fierce determination, ignoring the invisible shadow of fate trailing closely behind him. He approached the sleek, dangerous metal shell that had frightened a world champion. He reached out his large, grease-stained hands and began the tight process of squeezing his heavy frame into the cramped, exposed cockpit of the experimental Cooper. Big Bill stepped into a machine that even a racing legend shook his head at in terror. The fierce pride of a veteran had clouded his rationality, paving the way for the flames of death to ignite the French afternoon. Big Bill had forcefully inserted himself into the cramped, experimental cockpit of the streamlined Cooper T-39. Ignoring the chilling, whispered warnings of aerodynamic instability that had circulated through the paddock. Now, the deadly race was underway. He was inescapably swallowed by the deafening roar of the Coupe de Vitesse. The pack of tuned Grand Prix machines had torn away from the starting grid, transforming into a chaotic, high-speed swarm of vibrating metal and screaming exhaust notes. Whitehouse had his heavy leather boot resolutely pinned to the floorboard, pushing the unstable vehicle down one of the most notoriously dangerous stretches of asphalt in the entire world. He was hurtling down the endless French straightaway, pointing directly like a loaded weapon toward the heavy braking zone of the Tilloy hairpin. To truly comprehend the suffocating terror of this specific section of the Reims circuit, one must discard any modern conception of a sterile, highly engineered racetrack. This was not a smooth, laser-leveled surface designed meticulously with calculated runoff areas and shock-absorbing tire walls. It was a brutal, heavily crowned public highway, a crude ribbon of abrasive tarmac baking under the unforgiving July sun. The radiating thermal energy rising from the track surface severely distorted the horizon, transforming the distant corners into shimmering, watery mirages that played cruel tricks on the human eye. The physical borders of this high-speed arena offered zero forgiveness for failure. The edges of the road were sharply defined by rigid stone farm walls, deep agricultural ditches, and solid rows of ancient trees standing like silent executioners, waiting patiently for a single, fatal human error. Inside the open cockpit of the Cooper T-39, the physical environment was a suffocating hell. The raw, unprotected exhaust pipes radiated burning heat directly onto his legs. The concussive roar of the tuned engine located right behind his unprotected head obliterated all other sound, vibrating so intensely through the chassis that it blurred his vision. The rushing wind ripped past his face, battering his leather aviator cap. Every single human sense was heightened to a state of adrenaline-fueled overload. He was traveling at an extreme, terrifying velocity, actively pushing the fragile, unproven machine well past its logical, mechanical limits. But the true, hidden danger waiting to claim his life was not the harsh track itself. It was the very machine he had begged to drive. The experimental, streamlined Cooper was doing exactly what the future world champion Jack Brabham had warned it would do. As the speedometer needle climbed higher and higher, crossing into terrifying terminal velocities well over 140 miles per hour, the smooth, enclosed aluminum bodywork began to act as a crude, inefficient airplane wing. The air rushing underneath the flat belly of the car was moving at a wildly different velocity than the air rushing over the curved, aerodynamic top. This aerodynamic phenomenon created a massive, invisible pocket of low pressure. Lift. The entire chassis was being physically, forcefully pulled upward into the hot summer sky. Bill could feel the sickening sensation traveling directly through the heavy wooden steering wheel. The front wheels were becoming horrifyingly light, actively losing their critical, life-saving mechanical connection to the abrasive asphalt. The steering was becoming dangerously vague and entirely unresponsive to his inputs. He was no longer simply driving a race car. He was attempting to pilot a heavy metal missile actively trying to take flight. He had to rely entirely on decades of deeply ingrained muscle memory and sheer, brute strength to keep the unstable machine pointing straight, fighting the sudden crosswinds that threatened to throw the aerodynamic shell completely off the road. His breathing was shallow, his muscles tense, bathed in sweat inside the baking, vibrating cockpit. Down below, where the heavily grooved rubber desperately met the blistering tarmac, a catastrophic, invisible chain reaction was silently taking place. The bias-ply tires of the 1950s were primitive, heavily flawed constructs, entirely unsuited for the immense thermal and aerodynamic loads being placed upon them. The surface of the Reims circuit was holding heat like a massive brick oven. The continuous friction generated by the extreme speed was rapidly superheating the air trapped inside the inner tubes. The specialized aerodynamic bodywork that covered the wheels trapped the immense heat radiating from the heavy drum brakes, creating a localized oven around the rubber. The chemical bonds of the tire were breaking down, molecule by molecule, degrading rapidly under the intense, unrelenting stress. He was fully committed to the straight, his eyes entirely focused on the distant, approaching braking zone for the Thilwa hairpin. He needed to hold his speed just a fraction of a second longer to gain a critical advantage over the screaming pack behind him. He kept the heavy throttle wide open. Then, devoid of any warning, the razor-thin, precarious margin between calculated survival and disaster snapped. There was no warning light flashing on a dashboard. There was no sudden vibration to alert his hands. There was only a sudden, deafening, explosive crack that instantly overpowered the roar of the combustion engine. It sounded like a heavy cannon firing directly next to his ear. While running at extreme top speed, a catastrophic mechanical failure struck without mercy, a catastrophic tire blowout. The timeline of reality fractured, abruptly slowing down into a series of agonizing, hyper-detailed microseconds of inescapable horror. When a highly stressed tire ruptures at terminal velocity, the heavy racing car does not simply slide or decelerate. It drops. The front corner of the Cooper T-39 dug directly into the heavily abrasive asphalt. The delicate, compromised aerodynamic balance of the streamlined shell was completely shattered into pieces. The immense aerodynamic lift that had been pulling the car upward now combined with the sudden, massive drag of the shredded rubber grabbing the road. The heavy rear end of the machine viciously snapped sideways. Bill frantically wrestled with the heavy steering wheel, the rim jerking out of his grip with enough force to potentially break bone, his muscles straining against the immense G-forces in a desperate, instinctual attempt to correct the sudden slide. But the laws of physics had entirely taken over. The enclosed bodywork caught the rushing air like a massive, rigid sail. The car broke traction. It turned fully sideways, sliding perpendicular to its original direction of travel at a devastatingly high speed. The shredded remnants of the blown tire desperately bit into the abrasive asphalt, acting as a fixed, immovable anchor, while the kinetic energy of the speeding vehicle continued thrusting it forward. The car did not merely spin, it was violently tripped. The sudden, immense lateral friction overpowered the heavy weight of the chassis. The entire left side of the streamlined Cooper lifted off the ground. Hundreds of kilograms of raw metal, burning engine components, and highly volatile racing fuel were launched high into the hot French air. The machine became completely airborne, entirely surrendering to the brutal, uncontrollable laws of gravity and violent momentum. The car began a horrifying, high-speed series of somersaults. It flipped end over end, a heavy metallic toy tumbling out of control across the unforgiving asphalt. It vaulted high into the air, the heavy engine block acting as a swinging pendulum, pulling the nose of the car violently over the tail. It spun like a discarded machine whose tether had been severed. With every massive rotation, the blue sky and the dark asphalt swapped places in a dizzying blur. It smashed brutally back down onto the track. The sickening, deep metallic crunch of tubular steel bending and snapping under kinetic loads echoing across the fields. It was only to be launched back into the air by the dissipating kinetic energy. With every devastating, bone-crushing impact against the tarmac, the fragile aluminum bodywork tore away in massive, jagged chunks, sending sharp, lethal shrapnel flying dangerously in all directions. The aerodynamic shell shattered like fragile glass, peeling away from the frame and exposing the raw, spinning mechanical components beneath. The heavy suspension components snapped like brittle twigs. The massive engine block shifted within its mounts, tearing the internal mechanics completely apart. Inside the wildly rotating, collapsing metal tub, the 48-year-old veteran was helpless. He had no thick titanium roll bar above his head to take the crushing impact. He had no complex, multi-point safety harnesses to hold his body secure against the violent G-forces. He had no carbon fiber survival cell to absorb the blunt force trauma. He was being thrown around the cramped, open cockpit like a rag doll. The massive weight of the flipping vehicle repeatedly threatened to crush his unprotected skull directly against the harsh track surface. But the horrific, blunt force trauma of the multiple rollovers was not the ultimate fatal blow. The true horror of this 1957 tragedy, the dark detail that elevates this crash from a standard racing accident to an apocalyptic nightmare, arrived in the final, devastating milliseconds of the sequence. As the battered, upside-down Cooper chassis slammed against the track for the final time, the crushing impact catastrophically compromised the vulnerable, unprotected fuel system. The thin, lightweight metal tanks, positioned dangerously close to the driver and filled with gallons of raw, combustible, high-octane racing fuel, ruptured under the immense pressure. The spark that ignited the inferno was likely a shower of white-hot friction sparks generated by the raw steel frame grinding against the French tarmac at over 100 miles per hour. When the tank burst, the volatile liquid did not merely leak, it atomized. It sprayed out into the air as a fine, explosive mist. It washed rapidly over the glowing, superheated exhaust pipes and the sparking electrical wires exposed by the tearing metal. The ignition was instantaneous and apocalyptic. A massive, blinding, colossal fireball erupted from the shattered remnants of the Cooper. The violent chemical explosion engulfed the entire vehicle in a fraction of a single second, sending thick, pitch-black plumes of toxic smoke soaring high into the clear summer sky. The explosion did not just start a fire, it created a massive shockwave of heat. A colossal sphere of intense, blinding orange and black rapidly expanded outward. The localized heat generated by the raging inferno was so sudden and extreme that it began melting the remaining aluminum panels and scorching the track surface itself. The flames roared with a terrifying, consuming hunger. The beloved garage owner from Westmount, the gentle, smiling giant known universally throughout the competitive paddocks as Big Bill, the warm-hearted, kind man who happily wandered through garages, handing out sweet hard candies and cold ice creams to exhausted mechanics. He was trapped inside the very dead center of the roaring hellscape. The terrifying severity of the multiple rollovers combined with the suffocating intensity of the high-octane fire offered zero chance of survival or rescue. The flames consumed the cockpit entirely, turning the destroyed machine into a raging furnace. He perished instantly within the blazing, chaotic wreckage. Swallowed by the fire long before any track marshals, equipped with only rudimentary, inadequate handheld fire extinguishers, could even sprint toward the horrific scene. The veteran man, who had survived decades in a lethal sport, was erased in a matter of seconds. He was 48 years old. The flames burning brightly against the French sky took Big Bill away from this world forever. But the true brutality of fate had not finished its work, because directly behind him, a familiar pair of eyes was forced to witness this entire tragedy unfold. The thick, toxic black smoke billowing heavily into the clear French summer sky was visibly prominent from every single vantage point on the sprawling Reims circuit. For the thousands of cheering spectators packed tightly into the wooden grandstands, it was a sudden, thrilling spectacle of ultimate danger, an adrenaline-fueled interruption in their Sunday afternoon entertainment. They pointed, they gasped, and they eagerly waited for the race to continue. But for one specific driver, navigating the high-speed sweepers just a few miles behind the incident, that towering pillar of dark, suffocating smoke was a visceral, paralyzing death sentence. Brian Whitehouse was fiercely wrestling his own heavy machine around the demanding track. His muscles tense, his mind dialed into the relentless, hypnotic rhythm of the competition. He was pushing his engine, hunting for the slipstream of the cars ahead, entirely consumed by the exact same burning passion that had brought his father to this foreign asphalt. As he downshifted and rounded the long, sweeping bend pointing toward the heavy braking zone, his eyes locked onto the chaotic scene unfolding directly ahead of him on the edge of the tarmac. The emergency track marshals were frantically waving solid yellow flags, sprinting across the dangerous racing line in a state of uncoordinated panic. Resting violently against the side of the track, partially obscured by the curtain of chemical smoke, were the charred, unrecognizable, smoldering ruins of a streamlined Cooper chassis. The radiating heat was visibly shimmering above the destroyed wreckage. In the hyper-focused, insulated environment of professional motorsport, drivers are rigorously mentally conditioned to heavily compartmentalize sudden tragedy. When a driver sees a severe wreck on the side of the road, they are explicitly trained to ignore the human element, adjust their racing line to avoid the scattered debris, and keep their foot firmly pinned to the throttle. Empathy is a dangerous distraction at 150 miles per hour. But this was an entirely different, vicious, psychological beast. The metallic numbers barely visible on the burning, twisted chassis burned themselves permanently into Brian Whitehouse's retinas. The unique, streamlined shape of the borrowed car, a shape he had seen his father awkwardly squeeze into just an hour prior, confirmed his absolute worst, most paralyzing fear. He knew exactly, with horrifying certainty, who was trapped inside that twisted, blackened metal furnace. The realization hit the young man with the crushing, devastating force of a physical blow to the chest, stealing the oxygen from his lungs. The man who had patiently taught him how to properly hold a heavy steel wrench. The man who had gently guided his young hands over a greasy steering wheel back in the quiet safety of the Westmount garage in England. The man who had originally instilled in him this intoxicating love for pure speed was gone. The shared family passion, the unbreakable bond of motorsport that had brought a father and son together across the English Channel to compete on the global stage, had instantly mutated into a permanent, lifelong psychological nightmare. The deafening roar of his own racing engine, a mechanical sound he had loved deeply since his early childhood, was now irreparably stained with the inescapable memory of burning fuel and absolute, devastating loss. He was sitting inside the exact same type of machine that had just executed his father. Yet, remaining entirely true to his ingrained working-class British roots, Brian did not surrender to theatrical hysterics on the side of the track. There was no dramatic wailing, no falling to his knees on the asphalt, no screaming in agony into the hot summer wind. He carefully, methodically pulled his vehicle away from the racing line, navigated into the pit lane, quietly shut off the screaming ignition, and stepped out into the panicked energy of the paddock. He slowly removed his leather racing cap and his dust-covered goggles in complete, devastating silence. He swallowed the immense, agonizing wave of raw, unfiltered grief, burying it incredibly deep within his chest cavity. It is a profoundly heartbreaking brand of cultural stoicism. The unwavering refusal to break down in public, even while your entire universe has just been incinerated before your very eyes. He was forced by his own nature to internalize the horrific image of his father's fiery demise, wrapping his severe psychological trauma in a quiet, dignified, and impenetrable armor of silence. He had to face the unimaginable task of eventually returning to the United Kingdom, walking back through the familiar doors of the Westmount garage and seeing his father's heavy steel tools resting exactly where the old man had left them. Every single drop of dark oil on the cold concrete floor, every sharp scent of gasoline hanging in the garage air, would forever serve as a visceral, haunting trigger of the French inferno. The psychological burden of carrying the Whitehouse name forward in the racing world was now suffocatingly heavy. It was a cruel, twisted paradox where the very mechanical activity that defined their profound familial love was the exact instrument of his father's destruction. The paddock at Reims quickly descended into a suffocating state of mourning. Word rapidly spread down the pit lane, whispered from mechanic to mechanic, that the cheerful, sweet-dispensing giant was dead. The rugged, oil-stained mechanics who had just hours earlier happily accepted cold ice creams and hard candies from Big Bill's massive, generous hands were now standing paralyzed, staring blankly at the concrete floor in total, devastating disbelief. The warm, beating heart of the garages had been mercilessly ripped away. The man who treated them like family, the man who understood their exhaustion, had been consumed by the very machines they were paid to build. But the sheer brutality of the 1950s racing establishment was completely unmerciful. The race organizers, men in sharp suits standing safely in the control towers, did not wave a red flag to cancel the event out of respect for the fallen veteran. They did not halt the proceedings to allow the deeply traumatized drivers to process the immense tragedy that had just occurred on their asphalt. The schedule was absolute. The ticket holders had paid for a spectacle. The engines were ordered to continue screaming. The race blindly, callously marched forward into the sweltering afternoon, leaving the smoking wreckage of the Cooper to simply cool on the side of the road. And the Grim Reaper, having already claimed the beloved patriarch of the Paddock, had not yet finished his dark, terrible work on the French asphalt. The thirst of the circuit was not yet quenched. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen menacingly over the Champagne region, stretching long, dark fingers across the high-speed straights, a second, equally horrific wave of tragedy struck the circuit. An incredibly talented, promising, and fiercely driven American driver named Herbert Mackay Fraser was out on the track. He was pushing his own machine to the razor-thin limit in a desperate, highly competitive bid for victory, entirely ignoring the heavy shadow of death that had already fallen over the event. While navigating the treacherous, high-speed sections of the Reims layout, his vehicle suffered a catastrophic failure. His machine violently left the racing surface at a terrifying velocity, completely losing all mechanical grip. The car tumbled wildly, disintegrating upon heavy impact with the unforgiving environment, and instantly claiming the young American's life. Within the span of a single, devastatingly short afternoon, the celebrated, sun-baked Rangoon circuit had been completely transformed from a theater of sporting glory into a sprawling, open-air graveyard. The festive, champagne-soaked atmosphere of the French Grand Prix Festival was permanently erased. It was replaced by a thick, oppressive, and suffocating blanket of sheer human misery and severe psychological exhaustion. Two brilliant, passionate, and deeply committed men had been sacrificed on the cruel, unyielding altar of speed. The French racing authorities, the team managers, and the remaining drivers were left scrambling, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying magnitude of the carnage taking place on their watch. The Paddock was rendered utterly, profoundly silent as the sun finally began to set. The surviving drivers, the veteran mechanics, and the wealthy team executives were traumatized, forced to slowly, mechanically pack away their heavy steel tools and their broken ticking machines in the long, dark shadows of absolute tragedy. The romanticized, highly publicized illusion of motorsport glory had been violently stripped away, leaving only the cold, harsh, and unforgiving reality of sudden death and permanently shattered families. They loaded their trucks in silence, the heavy air thick with the realization that they were willingly participating in a blood sport that offered absolutely no guarantees of survival. In just a few short hours, the Reims circuit had swallowed 2 lives, but the legacy left behind by the old man who handed out sweets carried a meaning far deeper than the tears shed on the asphalt. Bill Whitehouse has permanently departed from this world, leaving behind a heavily scarred racing circuit and a completely devastated family. The undeniable contrast between the warm, gentle smile of a devoted father and his sudden, brutal demise within a blinding sea of fire perfectly exposes the ultimate, terrifying price of mechanical passion during the 1950s. This was a deeply dark, unforgiving decade where men did not merely drive cars. They used their own fragile, breathing bodies as direct collateral, placing their lives on the table to gamble for absolute speed. Big Bill was the tragic, heartbreaking embodiment of this lethal era. He was a sweet dispensing giant, a man who brought pure, decent humanity into the coldest, most cynical garages in Europe, only to be violently consumed by the intense, merciless heat imaginable on the French asphalt. He did not chase international fame, lucrative factory contracts, or the shallow adoration of the public. He raced purely for the profound, inescapable love of the machine, choosing to actively share that deep, ultimately fatal addiction with his own flesh and blood. He defied mechanical logic, he defied his own advanced age, and he paid the ultimate price for his stubborn dedication. He pushed the absolute limits of speed and left his heavy, tragic mark on motorsport history. The harrowing image of that roaring fireball serves as a permanent, chilling monument to the lethal stakes of early Formula One. A brutal, romanticized era when raw bravery frequently intersected with absolute devastation. What are your thoughts on Bill Whitehouse's final ride and the incredible legacy of this great father? Drop a comment below. If you like this video, please subscribe to Terminal Velocity for more stories. Thanks for tuning in, and farewell.